This Dimir deck is a mill build which aims to win the game via commander damage and or milling away our opponent's libraries. There are small sub-themes of life drain and direct damage included in the 99, but the primary objective is to cast spells and activate abilities that mass mill our opponents while Lazav is under our control. The majority of our spells and abilities mill each opponent as opposed to a target opponent. This allows us to skirt around hexproof and or shroud and presents a higher probability of milling powerful creatures to trigger Lazav's shapeshifting ability. Due to his shapeshifting ability, Lazav can become a copy of any creature that is put into our opponent's graveyard. With built-in protection in the form of hexproof, Lazav can elude targeted removal and disruption, granting him staying power and making it easier for him to swing in for lethal commander damage.
Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. Lazav, Dimir Mastermind is a 3/3 legendary shapeshifter with hexproof for 2 blue and 2 black mana. Whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, we may have Lazav, Dimir Mastermind become a copy of that card, except its name is still Lazav, it's legendary in addition to its other types, and it gains hexproof and this ability. Lazav wants us to get creature cards into our opponent's graveyard, and the 99 of this deck will ensure that we do so. The following group of cards are spells and effects that mill all of our opponents. This helps to maximize the opportunity for Lazav to become a much more threatening creature if there are more opponents milling their creature cards into their libraries. Additionally, this helps to skirt around the potential of hexproof, shroud, or protection. We begin with Altar of the Brood, an artifact for 1 mana. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Granted, we do not have a lot of token-making spells in the 99 of this deck. However, the incremental and incidental milling will help Lazav with many opportunities to become a creature and stay it if he likes it. Next up, we have for 1 blue mana, we have Ruin Crab. It has the landfall mechanic. It's an 0/3. It'll sit back and chump block if needed. Each time a land enters a battlefield under our control, each opponent mills 3 cards. And if we also have Altar of the Brood out on the battlefield in conjunction with Ruin Crab, each time a land enters a battlefield under our control, that will be 4 cards milled. Next up in the 2-drop, we have Maddening Cacophony, a sorcery for 1 and a blue mana. Each opponent mills 8 cards. However, if we also pay the kicker cost, which is 3 and an additional blue mana, we will have each opponent mill half their library rounded up. So if we have this card in our opening hand and we get Lazav out onto the battlefield on curve, we may consider casting Maddening Cacophony in order to catch some lightning in a bottle and have Lazav become a very threatening presence on the battlefield. However, mid to late game, paying 4 and 2 mana for each opponent to mill half their library, that may be much more tempting. Either way, Maddening Cacophony is one of the most powerful mill spells we have in the 99 of this deck. Staying with a mana value of 2, this time it's an artifact, it is Mind Crank. Whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. One of the most under-heralded effects that Mind Crank helps out is that our opponents that are attacking our other opponents will trigger Mind Crank without us having to do anything. If opponent 1 attacks opponent 3 and deals 5 points of combat damage, well, that's going to be 5 cards milled from opponent number 3's library. Moving up to a mana value of 3, we have Bruvac, the Grandiloquent. It's a 1/4 human advisor. If an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they mill twice that many cards instead. And if you can have Bruvac on the battlefield with a kicked Maddening Cacophony, outside of any automatic shuffle effects that may be in our opponent's libraries, it looks like that may be good game. Staying with a mana cost of 3, we have Court of Cunning, an enchantment for 1 and 2 blue mana. When Court of Cunning ETBs, we become the Monarch. At the beginning of our upkeep, any number of target players each mill 2 cards. However, if we're the Monarch, those players will mill 10 cards instead. So if we can maintain possession of the oh-so-valuable Monarch emblem, then at the beginning of our upkeep, each one of our opponents will be milling 10 cards, and depending on how many opponents are sitting at the EDH table, well, that's just going to amplify the potential of Lazav becoming a very, very threatening creature on the battlefield. Sticking with a mana value of 3, this time triple blue, it is Fractured Sanity. Each opponent mills 14 cards. So just for the investment of 3 blue mana, each opponent is going to mill 14 cards. It also has the cycling mechanic, which we pay 1 and a blue, discard it, and draw a card. And if we do cycle Fractured Sanity, each opponent mills 4 cards. So if we are in need of an important card in the mid to late game, we can still trigger a cycling ability. And this also promotes the potential of having some kind of combat shenanigans. Send Lazav into combat. It's just a 3/3. Maybe we couldn't find any creatures that wanted to become a copy of. Opponent says no blocks. We cycle Fractured Sanity, and suddenly maybe we just hit a Blightsteel Colossus, which actually wouldn't work. Or would it? Fractured Sanity, 3 blue mana. Staying with the mana value of 3, we have Memory Erosion, an enchantment for 1 and 2 blue mana. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this is a way in which to tax our opponents with precious cards from the top of their library, because every single one that hits the yard is just another opportunity to shapeshift Lazav. And our last spell with a mana value of 3, we have Psychic Corrosion. Whenever we draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So with the basic fundamental of Magic of drawing cards just for playing the game, we can ensure that our opponents are going to be milling the cards from the top of their library. And every time they do so, we get closer and closer of Lazav taking over the game completely. Jumping past a mana value of 4 to a mana value of 5, we have Consuming Aberration. It is a horror with star for its power toughness for 3 in Dimir colors. Consuming Aberration's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in our opponent's graveyards. Our opponent's graveyards are going to be inundated with cards. We might as well have a huge beater on the battlefield to take advantage of that. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any evasion with Consuming Aberration. However, its ability to attack is not the primary reason it's included in the 99. Whenever we cast a spell, each opponent reveals a top card of their library until they reveal a land card, then puts all of those cards into their graveyard. Consuming Aberration can be an intimidating force on the battlefield, not just for power and toughness, but the way in which it can rip through our opponent's libraries, giving more and more opportunities for Lazav. Next up, we have a sorcery for 3 in Dimir colors once more, and it is Extract from Darkness. Each player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. Then we put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. So this will affect us. This will put 2 of our cards into from our library into our graveyard, which will have no effect on Lazav. However, we do have the potential of Lazav triggering with any one of those potentially super powerful valuable creatures that might hit the graveyard. Additionally, if it's not a legendary creature and it is a very, very powerful creature, Lazav could become a copy of that creature, and then we could take that same creature with Extract from Darkness, and suddenly we have 2 copies of potentially game-ending creatures. Of course, if they're legendary, that won't work due to the legend rule. Another mana value of 5. This one is mono black. It is Sir Conrad the Grim, a 5/4 human knight for 3 and 2 black mana. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, which could potentially just mean milling, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. And one of the most beneficial things about Sir Conrad is it has a built-in mill effect. We can pay 1 and a black mana, and each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So if we have no other mill effects in our hand, Sir Conrad the Grim comes equipped with 1 of those mill effects. Anytime that any creature is milled from our opponent's library into the graveyard is going to deal 1 point of damage to each opponent. Sir Conrad the Grim could be considered win condition number 2 outside of our commander. And our last spell that's going to affect milling for all of our opponents, it is Mind Grind. It is a sorcery for X and Dimir colors. Each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal X land cards. Then they put all cards revealed this way into their graveyard. X, of course, cannot be 0. So Mind Grind could really put a ton of cards into the graveyard from each of our opponents, just giving Lazav more and more of an opportunity to latch on to one of those creatures and then completely take over the game. The following group of cards are spells and effects that will mill one of our opponents. Some of them may be used to mill us. It should be important to mention that. However, milling ourselves is not beneficial in this deck, as Lazav is not going to trigger from any of our creatures hitting the graveyard. So any of instances of these spells or effects that say a target player, most likely we're going to choose one of our opponents. And we're going to begin in the 2 spot with Altar of Dementia. We sacrifice a creature, and target player puts a number of cards equal to that creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. If you think back to our previous segment when we had Consuming Aberration out, if we have a very, very big Consuming Aberration and Altar of Dementia on the battlefield under our control at the same time, it is possible that we could mill one of our opponents just by sacrificing Consuming Aberration. That is, of course, absent any automatic shuffle effects from that player's library. Ticking up to a CMC of 3, we have Fraying Sanity, an enchantment or a curse that we enchant a player. At the beginning of each end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. Under the right set of circumstances, if we are able to cast Fraying Sanity on one of our opponents and then hit a kicked Maddening Cacophony, again, outside of any potential automatic shuffle effects, that opponent is going to mill out. Milling out opponents is a very real win condition in this deck, and it is one that should be looked forward to in the case of Lazav getting locked down. Up to a CMC of 4, staying wonderfully on curve, we have 1 copy of Startled Awake. It is a sorcery for 2 and 2 blue mana. Target opponent puts the top 13 cards of their library into their graveyard. We may pay 3 and 2 blue to put Startle Awake from our graveyard onto the battlefield transformed. We may only activate this ability anytime we could cast a sorcery. And when it is transformed, Startled Awake becomes Persistent Nightmare, a 1/1 nightmare with Skulk. Skulk is a lesser-known mechanic from Shadows over Innistrad that says this creature can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. So as long as we turn Persistent Nightmare sideways at one of our opponents, and any other creatures with a power greater than 1 will not be able to block it. When Persistent Nightmare deals this eventual combat damage to a player, we get to return it to our hand, and when we do, we return it to our hand as Startled Awake, which allows us to, once again, cast it for 2 and 2 blue and have target opponent mill the top 13 cards of their library. This can help us in the mid to late game if we're starting to slow down with all of the spells that we're using to help mill out our opponents. We can look at Startled Awake as one of our potential win conditions. Next up with a CMC of 5, we have Mirko Vosk, Mind Drinker, a 2/4 legendary vampire with flying for 3 in Dimir colors. Whenever Mirko Vosk, Mind Drinker, deals combat damage to a player, that player reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal 4 land cards. they put all those cards into their graveyard. The flying that is on Mirko Vosk helps with the evasion, of course, particularly if none of our opponents or any one of our opponents do not have any creatures with flying or reach. We can turn Mirko sideways, land with 2 points of combat damage, and then watch as our opponent begins to mill their library into their graveyard, hopefully finding something that Lazav can latch onto. Staying with a CMC of 5 for the exact same casting cost, we have Nemesis of Reason, a 3/7 Leviathan horror that whenever it attacks, defending player puts the top 10 cards of their library into their graveyard. A robust toughness of 7 ensures that Nemesis of Reason should survive most combats, particularly if it's one-on-one. With only a power of 3, it may be likely that our opponent just decides to not even worry about blocking Nemesis of Reason. The 3/7 could be a little misleading, however, because each time it's turned sideways, whoever Nemesis of Reason is attacking, well, they're thinning their library by 10 cards, which just gives Lazav more and more of a chance to end the game. Staying with the CMC of 5, our last for this segment of the video, we have Traumatized. 3 and 2 blue at sorcery speed. Target player puts the top half of their library, rounded down, into their graveyard. This is a great way to chunk mill one of our opponents, and again, we're not looking to do this to ourselves. And the last spell for this subset of the deck tech video, we have Geth, Lord of the Vault, a 5/5 legendary zombie with Intimidate for 4 and 2 black mana. We may pay X and a black to put target artifact or creature card with converted mana cost X from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control tapped. Then that player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard. So we get to completely take one of our opponent's creatures or artifacts, and whenever the casting cost of that card is, they're going to add those many cards from their library right into their graveyard. Again, filling their yards, giving Lazav so many more opportunities to win the game. As our opponents are going to have very robust graveyards due to all of our mill spells and effects, we want to make sure we include a subset of cards that are going to be advantageous for us to cast with respect to those filled graveyards. So the following group of cards looks to take advantage of all of those fat, juicy graveyards. The first one is Blood Chief Ascension, an enchantment for 1 black mana. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, we may put a quest counter on Blood Chief Ascension. Note right there that we do not have to be the causers of this loss of life. Any opponent that ends up taking 2 points of damage for having a shock land come into play untapped, well, we're going to put a counter on Blood Chief Ascension at the beginning of the end step. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Blood Chief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, we may have that player lose 2 life, and if we do, we gain 2 life. It's not difficult to get Blood Chief Ascension online, as it only needs 3 quest counters. Once active, and as an enchantment, which generally has a great deal of staying power in our format, we could look to an online Blood Chief Ascension to easily be a game-winning card. Staying with the mana value of 1 black, we have Reanimate, a sorcery. We can put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and we lose life equal to its converted mana cost. Notice it does not have to be from our graveyard or from target opponent's graveyard. It's just from any graveyard, any creature that we want to have on the battlefield on our side. All we're going to do is pay some life and tap 1 black mana. Jumping to a CMC of 3, we have Nighthawk Scavenger, a 1+star/3 vampire rogue with flying, death touch, and lifelink for 1 and 2 black mana. Nighthawk Scavenger's power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in our opponent's graveyards. With so many spells and effects being able to fill up our opponent's graveyard, we should look to Nighthawk Scavenger to be around a 5/6/3 for just the investment of 3 mana. Having the flying for evasion, the death touch for defensive purposes, and lifelink makes Nighthawk Scavenger one of the most valuable creatures we have, particularly from the 3 spot. Jumping from 1 to 3 to 5 and another mono black edition, we have Chainer Dementia Master. It is a 3/3 minion legend for 3 and 2 black mana. All nightmares get +1/+1. We may pay 3 black, pay 3 life, and put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. That creature is black and is a nightmare in addition to its other types. So it's going to get the static +1/+1 boost from Chainer's All Nightmares Get +1/+1 ability. And when Chainer Dementia Master leaves play, remove all nightmares from the game. So this is just another way in which to get creatures out of our opponent's graveyards and onto the battlefield under our control. Staying with mono black with the exact same casting cost of 3 and double black, we have Guilt Feeder, a 0/4 horror with fear. Now fear is whenever a creature has fear, it can only be blocked by artifact and or black creatures. So if you're sitting at a commander table and no one has any black or artifact creatures, Guilt Feeder is going to slide in unblocked. And whenever Guilt Feeder attacks and isn't blocked, defending player loses 1 life for each card in their graveyard. We start with 40 life in EDH. It's not going to be a very difficult thing to have at least 40 cards in an opponent's graveyard and then turn Guilt Feeder sideways and watch that opponent say good game. Next up with the CMC of 6, staying with mono black of course, it is Rakshasa Debaser, a 6/6 cat demon for 4 and 2 black mana. Whenever Rakshasa Debaser attacks, we put target creature card from defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. No mana, no tricks, just turn this cat demon sideways and gain control of one of our opponent's creatures that's buried in their graveyard. Additionally, Rakshasa Debaser has the Encore mechanic. If we pay 6 and 2 black, we will exile this card from our graveyard, and for each opponent, we create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. These tokens have haste. We sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, and we can only activate the Encore mechanic as a sorcery. So even if Rakshasa Debaser is in our graveyard, for the investment of 8 mana, we're going to be able to attack each one of our opponents with a token copy of this cat demon, and yet again borrow one of our opponent's creatures buried in their graveyards. And our last graveyard-specific card for this subsection of the deck tech, it is Rise of the Dark Realms. 7 and 2 black for a sorcery. We put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control. Why settle for 1 or 2 when we can just pump 9 into this sorcery and get them all? Earlier in this deck tech video, we mentioned the presence of a Voltron package that can be used to help Lazav win the game through lethal commander damage. The following group of cards is considered to be the 99's Voltron package. We begin with Commander's Plates, an equipment for 1 mana. It equips to our commander for 3. It equips to any one of our other creatures for 5. And it gives equipped creature +3/+3 and protection from each color that's not in our commander's color identity. So for the purposes of our Dimir leader Lazav, Commander Plate will give Lazav +3/+3 and protection from white, red, and green. Next equipment with a CMC of 2, we have Hero's Blade. Equipped creature gets +3/+2 for an equip cost of 4. However, whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under our control, we may attach Hero's Blade to it. Let's be honest, we are never going to pay 4 to equip Hero's Blade onto Lazav, because Lazav is going to come down and it's going to have Hero's Blade attached to it if it's already on the battlefield. Another equipment with a mana value of 2. This time it is Lightning Greaves. 2/2 cast, 0 to equip. An equipped creature has haste and shroud. This may be one of the best equipments that we can slap onto Lazav, even though it does have hexproof. Having Lazav get haste, particularly if we have any other mill spell or effects and a very empty battlefield, that could mean lights out for one of our opponents. Equipment number 4, again with a mana value of 4. This time, we have Mask of Riddles. For Dimir colors, 1 blue, 1 black, we're going to give Lazav Fear, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, we will draw a card, and the equip cost is also 2. So giving Lazav Fear means that as long as our opponents don't have any black or artifact creatures, Lazav will attack unblocked. Another way to give Lazav unblockability is to include Trailblazer's Boots. It's an equipment that costs 2 to cast and 2 to equip. Equipped creature has non-basic land walk. Think to yourself, how many of your decks, or how many decks that you've ever sat down at a commander table with, have 0 non-basic lands? I didn't think the answer would take that long. Most likely the answer is 0, because everybody in Commander is at least minimally going to have a command tower in their deck. Trailblazer's Boots will make sure to punish any and all opponents that play with non-basic lands by giving our commander, Lazav, Dimir Mastermind, non-basic land walk. That means if they have a non-basic land, Lazav is going to be unblockable. And lastly, the last piece of Voltron equipment for our commander, it is Darksteel Plate, a mana value of 3 with an equip cost for 2. Darksteel Plate is indestructible, and equipped creature is indestructible. So if we can get this onto Lazav with its hexproof ability, it's going to cause our opponents an inordinate amount of difficulty to remove Lazav from the battlefield. Lazav's ability reads, whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere. So far, throughout the majority, if not all, of this deck tech, we have focused on mill as a way in which to get those cards into our opponent's graveyards. However, with our next subset of cards, removal and disruption, we're going to have some additional ways to get creature cards into our opponent's graveyards, whether it's coming from their hand or the battlefield. Let's begin with a mono blue instant for 1. It is Pongify. Destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. Its controller creates a 3/3 green ape creature token, and then Lazav gets to become a copy of whatever uber powerful creature that was that we decided to cast Pongify at. Pongify is an amazing blue card. Still can't believe that they have a card like that in blue for 1 blue mana, and still can't believe that they did it twice. Rapid Hybridization. It is Pongify, except we don't leave our opponent with a 3/3 green ape creature token. They get a 3/3 green frog lizard instead. Alright, moving up to a mana value of 2, still at instant speed, we have Absorb Identity. Return target creature to its owner's hand. We may have shapeshifters we control become copies of that creature until end of turn. This fits Lazav perfectly because as I shift Absorb Identity downward a bit, it reveals that yes, Lazav is a shapeshifter. So if we want to make sure that we can trigger a copy ability by Lazav, even if that creature is not hitting the graveyard, Absorb Identity will allow us to do that. Number 4, we have another instant, Drown in the Lock. For Dimir colors, we choose one of the following 2 modes. Either we counter target spell with a CMC less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. For many players, that is preferable. For me, I tend to have a general disdain for counter magic, so more likely than not, I will be choosing the second mode, which is destroy target creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. I will point out, however, if you so choose to use Drown in the Lock's first mode, and that spell that's being countered is a creature spell, it is hitting the graveyard, and you could trigger Lazav's ability and become a copy of that creature card. Moving upwards to a mana value of 3, we are going to have a creature, and that is going to be Fleshbag Marauder. 3/1 zombie warrior for 2 and a black. When it ETBs, each player sacrifices a creature. Now, the creature that we sacrifice will not trigger Lazav. However, every opponent that has a creature and they choose to sacrifice it, those are more opportunities for Lazav to shift his shape. We like Fleshbag Marauder that much that we decided to include Merciless Executioner. It's a 3/1 Orc Warrior for 2 and a black, and it does the exact same thing that Fleshbag Marauder does. Next up, we have another instant murder. Straight murder. 1 and 2 black, destroy target creature. That's it. The creature goes to the graveyard, and maybe Lazav becomes a copy of it. Again, we have Murderous Rider, another 3 CMC spell. However, for this card, we have 2 spells in 1. We can choose to cast Swift End, which is 1 and 2 black to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and we lose 2 life. If we do cast Swift End, we then exile this to the Adventure Zone, where it waits to be cast for 1 and 2 black mana to become Murderous Rider, a 2/3 with lifelink, and when Murderous Rider dies, we may put it on the bottom of our library. Alright, because we liked Fleshbag Marauder so much, and because we liked Merciless Executioner that much, we might as well include Plague Crafter. It's a 3/2 human shaman for the exact same mana value of 2 and a black. When it ETBs, each player sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker. This time, however, each player who can't sacrifice a creature or a planeswalker, well, they're going to discard a card. So one way or another, we're going to get a card into that graveyard. Next up, sticking with a CMC of 3, we have Poison the Cup. It's an instant destroy target creature. If this spell was foretold, however, we get to scry 2. To foretell this spell, we would pay 1 and a black, and during our turn, we may pay 2 mana and exile this card from our hand face down. Then we cast it for 1 and a black mana later, not during the same turn, unfortunately, for its foretell cost. So what we're looking to do here is instead of casting 1 and 2 black just to destroy target creature, we pay 2 mana up front, we foretell it, and then sometime later in the game, we pay 1 and a black to destroy that same creature, but this time we get to scry 2 as well. Staying with our CMC of 3, our last one of this subset of cards, it is Recoil. An instant 1 in Dimir colors, return target permanent to its owner's hand. Then that player discards a card. Maybe it will be a creature card. Who knows? All right, CMC of 4, we have Baleful Mastery. Now, this gives us the option to cast this spell for 1 and a black rather than 3 and a black. However, if we so choose to cast the spell for 1 and a black, an opponent gets to draw a card. I don't like that, so I don't like helping out opponents, so most likely I am not ever going to cast this spell for 1 and a black. Baleful Mastery reads exile target creature or planeswalker. Now, there has to be a little bit of conversation here because we want creature cards hitting the graveyard, so why would we include a spell that says exile target creature? There are some creatures that can't hit the graveyard or don't hit the graveyard for very long. There are some creatures that we just need to get off of the game as quickly and as soon as possible. Not so much for planeswalkers, but definitely for creatures. We can afford to exile a creature, which, let's be honest, it's very, very difficult to bring a creature back from exile, so much more than getting it back from the graveyard. Having an option in Baleful Mastery to rid the game completely of a creature is very, very important because you do not want the opponents to have the ability to continuously recur them. Everything I said about Baleful Mastery applies to the next spell, which is Eat to Extinction. Instant speed, 3 and a black, exile target creature or planeswalker, and then look at the top card of our library, and we may put that card into our graveyard. Ticking up to a CMC of 5, now we are going to talk about Enter the God Eternals. Sorcery speed for 2 blue and a black. Enter the God Eternals will deal 4 damage to target creature, and we gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. Target player mills the top 4 cards of their library, and then we get to amass 4. To amass 4, we put 4 +1/+1 counters on an army we control, and if we don't control one, first we create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token, and then put those 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So, for the investment of 5 mana, we hopefully get to destroy a creature that has a toughness 4 or less. We gain 4 life. we have one of our opponents mill the top 4 cards of the library, and we get a 4/4 creature out of it. That is a lot of versatility in one spell for just 5 mana. Staying with 5 mana, this time going to instants, we're going to talk about Zot's Will, 4 and a black, and we get to choose one. However, if we control Lazav at the time we cast the spell, we may choose both. The 2 modes read, each opponent sacrifices a creature they control with the greatest power. The second mode reads, exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards, then create X01 black Thrall creature tokens where X is the greatest power among creature cards exiled this way. So, more likely than not, the second mode is not going to be utilized a great deal because we need those cards to be in the graveyard as a way in which to fulfill and act as fodder for our graveyard-specific spells. However, we also do understand that a lot of EDH players like to use graveyards as an extension of their hand. And for the players that choose to do that, we're going to need to exile those graveyards as quickly as possible. All right, up to a mana value of 6, but we will never be casting this spell for 6. Let me explain why. We have Curtain's Call. It is an instant. It has the Undaunted mechanic, which means it costs 1 less to cast for each opponent we have. And this lets us destroy 2 target creatures. So minimally, we're going to be paying 4 and a black for that. No, that's not minimally. I say at the maximum, we'll be paying 4 and a black at instant speed to destroy 2 target creatures. Because any fewer opponents than 1 means that Lazav has already won the game. All right, just a few spells left. We're going to tick up from 6 to 7, and now we're going to start talking about some mass removal with Necromantic Selection. Sorcery speed 4 and triple black. We destroy all creatures, then return a creature card put into a graveyard this way to the battlefield under our control. It's a black zombie in addition to its other types and colors, and then we exile Necromantic Selection. There will be a time where we may need to cast this and Lazav is on the battlefield. So we just have Lazav go to the graveyard and then bring him back to the battlefield. All right, up to a CMC of 8. Yeah, we're getting to the big ends. Now we have Avatar of Woe. I can promise you, we will never be paying 8 to cast Avatar of Woe. That is because if there are 10 or more creature cards in all graveyards, Avatar of Woe costs 6 less to cast. It will be nearly impossible for there to not be at least 10 creature cards in all graveyards at the time we want to cast Avatar of Woe. She is a 6/5 with Fear, which means she can only be blocked by black or artifact creatures, and we can tap Avatar of Woe to destroy target creature. It cannot be regenerated. For the purposes of this deck, however, and its mill intensity, we can expect to say Avatar of Woe, 2 black mana for a 6/5 with Fear that we can tap to destroy target creature, and it can't be regenerated. All right, we have 2 spells left, and one of them, well, I like to think one of them was the precursor of the other. Let me explain. For 7 and 2 black mana at sorcery speed, we have Plague Wind. Destroy all creatures you don't control. They can't be regenerated. Imagine having Lazav on the battlefield and opponents with very intimidating armies, both by quantity and quality. Cast a Plague Wind and allow Lazav to become any one of those creatures of your choice that just hit the yard, and then swing in for potentially game-ending commander damage. Plague Wind was so good back during the days of Prophecy that they decided to make it even better. And that is with In Garruk's Wake. Same CMC of 7 and 2 black. However, we exchange the potential to not have creatures regenerated by also destroying all planeswalkers that we don't control. The next few cards we're going to consider to be our miscellaneous cards. These are cards that are going to help us with some card advantage, as well as smoothing out the top of our library. Now, I should take this moment to point out, if the expectation is to see demonic tutors and vampiric tutors and other types of tutors floating around the 99, We are not going to do that with this deck. I don't believe that there are any 1, 2, or 3 cards in this deck that are going to be looked at as automatic win conditions every single time. I believe the 99 of this deck has been crafted in such a way that it is an overall strength from top to bottom. Therefore, we don't need to muck up. I shouldn't say muck up because tutors are not necessarily bad cards to have. However, I think it will be advantageous to point out that with the number of high-quality spells and effects presented in the 99 from top to bottom, it seems unnecessary to include copies of Demonic Tutor, of Vampiric Tutor, of Grim Tutor, when those copies could be better served in other decks. With that being said, we have 3 cards in this section, so let's talk about them briefly. The first one is Lim-Dûl's Vault. At instant speed for Dimir colors, we can look at the top 5 cards of our library. As many times as we choose, we may pay 1 life to put those cards on the bottom of our library and look at the next top 5 cards of our library. Then we shuffle all but the top 5 cards of our library and put those 5 on top of our library in any order. Effects that prevent or redirect damage cannot be used to counter this loss of life. This is as close to a tutor as we're going to get in this deck, and more often than not, this is just being used to set up future draws. And we have a CMC of 3. We're going to go 2, 3, 4 here. This time it is an enchantment. We have Phyrexian Arena, 1 in double black. At the beginning of our upkeep, we draw a card and we lose 1 life. It is the special of what black does. You pay 1 life, you draw 1 card. And lastly, with a CMC of 4, we're going to cast Fact or Fiction. It's an instant. It's, like I said, 3 and 1 blue mana. We're going to reveal the top 5 cards of our library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. We put 1 into our hand and the other into our graveyard. Depending on the state of the game and the state of the board, Fact or Fiction could be used for potentially political ramifications. More often than not, however, it's end of turn Fact or Fiction, and that generally leads to good game. And now this deck tech comes to a close with an examination of the mana base. We have several mana rocks and then the lands to talk about, so let's get right to the best one in our format. We have a Soul Ring. It's going in. It does not help us to cast Lazav outside of paying the commander tax, and that should be pointed out. Lazav at its best is going to come out on curve 2 blue and 2 black. Helping to establish that on-curve casting of our general, we have a Wayfarer's Bauble, an artifact for 1. We pay 2, we tap it, we sacrifice it, we search our library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped. It's Dimir's version of Rampant Growth. Arcane Signet, most likely considered artifact number 1B to Soul Ring's 1A. For 2 mana, we're going to cast this artifact, and then we're going to turn it sideways for a blue or a black, and it's the one artifact we want to see in our hand with our opening hand. If we don't have an Arcane Signet, then maybe we have a Dimir Signet. Same CMC, however, we tap and pay 1, tap the Dimir Signet to get a blue and black mana. Next up, as a way in which to ramp out, not exactly like a Wayfarer's Bauble, we have Sword of the Animist. It is an equipment. It costs 2 to cast and 2 to equip. Equip creature gets +1/+1, and whenever it attacks, we may search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Hopefully we can send that creature into combat safely so that we can continue to use Sword of the Animist's combat trigger. That would be most advantageous. Just for the basic fundamental of sending a creature into combat, we get to rampant growth out of our deck. Next up, we have another CMC of 2. This one is Talisman of Dominance. It's going to cost 2, like we said, but it's going to turn sideways for 1, or it's going to turn sideways for a blue and a black mana at the cost of 1 life. And lastly, for our mana rocks, we have 1 copy of Commander Sphere. It costs 3, it taps for 1 blue or 1 black for the purposes of our Dimir deck, and we can sacrifice Commander Sphere to draw a card. Alright, those are our mana rocks. Now let's talk about the lands themselves. So, It is most important to get to our 2 blue and 2 black as readily as possible. Many previous iterations of this deck struggled to do that without paying close attention to the balance of the mana. We want to make sure that we get to the 2 blue and 2 black as quickly and as often as possible, and in so doing, we are going to include as many dual lands as possible. However, we want to make sure that we have enough basic lands to, utilize some of the effects that we've already talked about, similar like we're talking about with Wayfarer's Bauble and Sword of the Animus. So with that being said, here's our stack of islands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 basic islands to start things off. And because we are looking at symmetry here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we have 9 basic swamps, 9 basic islands, 9 basic swamps, 2 blue, 2 black, doing the best we can to make sure that we can get to Lazav's needed colors, because once we get that, anything else is just going to be considered colorless commander tags. Alright, so before we get to our stack of dual lands, we are going to showcase a couple of specialized lands that are only going to give us 1 color, but they're definitely going to help throughout the game. The first one is Castle Vantress. When it enters the battlefield, it's going to enter the battlefield tapped unless we control an island. We can tap to add a blue, or we can pay 2 and 2 blue and tap Castle Vantress to scry 2. We know the advantages of being able to use our lands for any kind of auxiliary purposes in the mid to late game, and Castle Vantress helps us to do that in spades. As long as we have the mana available, we can filter the top of our library to get the cards needed to either win or close out the game. If we've got the castle for blue, then pretty much we're going to have the castle for black, Castle Lochthwain, or what should be referred to as a Star Destroyer. Castle Lochthwain will also enter the battlefield tapped unless we control a swamp. We can tap it for a black, or we can pay 1 and 2 black, tap it, and we can draw a card. Then we lose life equal to the number of cards in our hand. In the mid to late game, it may be worth reconciling losing some life in order to get an additional card in our hand, particularly if we're 1 mill spell away from winning the game. Alright, next up, we have an entire stack of dual lands. Now, these lands are going to give us either our blue or our black. There may be some conditions upon their tapping or upon their entering, but most importantly, they're going to do what we need to do to get the mana fixed in order to cast Lazav as quickly as possible. Alright, so we're going to start with our Choked Estuary. It's a blue or a black. It comes into play untapped as long as we reveal an island or swamp card when we play it. We have our Pathway. Now, with the exception of the Pathway, this will not give us a blue or a black. We make the choice prior to playing the land. It's either going to give us the blue or the black. One way or another, we should be able to benefit from having that choice. Of course, the best land in our format, 1 copy of Command Tower. Darkwater Catacombs. We're going to tap a colorless. We're going to tap this, and this is going to give us a blue and a black mana. So we can use our Soul Ring in order to get colored mana to help cast Lazav. We can use our Talisman of Dominance, the colorless ability, in order to get our blue and black mana. We have Dreadship Reef. This is going to give us a colorless mana. However, we can also pay 1 mana, tap this, and put a storage counter on it. Then we can pay a colorless mana, remove X storage counters from it, and add X mana in any combination of blue or black to our mana pool. For me, I love seeing Dreadship Reef in my opening hand because we are able to get the X. We're able to put the storage counters on this as we're building up our mana in order to cast Lazav. And also notice we can tap this for a colorless, and then use that same colorless mana to remove the storage counters to get the colored mana needed to cast Lazav or any of our other spells. We have our Dimir Checkland, Drowned Catacombs. That's going to come into play untapped as long as we have an island or a swamp when it ETBs. We have Fetid Pools. Now, this land is an island swamp, but it is going to come into play tapped. If needed, we can cycle this card away and draw a card at any time. We have Morphic Pool. This is going to come into play untapped as long as we have at least 2 opponents. River of Tears. We're going to tap this to add a blue mana to our mana pool. If we played a land this turn, we'll add black to that mana pool instead. So this gives us some flexibility with respect to fixing our mana. Just be careful that you don't play your land haphazardly and end up missing out on the color you need without understanding exactly what you have in front of you. Sunken Hollow. This is our Dimir battle land. It will enter the battlefield tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands. Again, this is what we were talking about earlier with including a total of 18 basic lands. Sunken Hollow will come into play untapped as long as we have at least 2 of them. Sunken Ruins is our Dimir filter land. It taps for a colorless, or we can pay a blue or a black, tap it, and get any combination of 2 Dimir mana. We have Tainted Isle. I love the Tainted series from Torment. It's such a good cycle of cards. Alright, Tainted Isle will tap for a colorless. However, we can tap it for a blue or a black if we control a swamp. And we should have swamps out on the battlefield. Next up, we have our Dimir Painland. It's Underground River. It taps for a colorless, or it taps for a blue and a black as long as we take 1 point of damage. And lastly, we have our Watery Grave. It is our Dimir Shockland. It comes into play tapped unless we pay 2 life. Now, this is the moment in the video where I will point out, as Magic continues to cycle and create, let me frame this, as Magic continues to create more and more cycles of dual lands, if those lands are appropriate, similar to Shipwreck Marsh, which is one of the newer lands from the land cycle from Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Innistrad Crimson Vow, they will find their way into the mana base of this deck, replacing basic lands. Each new, fundamentally good dual land that can give us a blue or a black will eventually take the place of our basic lands. And if we need to make adjustments with respect to some of the spells and effects we have that are targeting our basic lands, well, then those are revisions to be made another day. Alright, that is 1 commander and 97 cards. We have 2 lands left, and each of them are going to be vitally important as ways in which Lazav can close out a game. Card number 98, we have Command Beacon. Taps for a colorless mana, which is going to be a bit of a sticking point, because as I stressed earlier in this section of the deck tech, we want to make sure we fix our blue and black mana as quickly as possible so we never have to stumble out of the gates with respect to casting Lazav. However, if the land has an ability on it that can enhance the overall theme of the 99 and what we're trying to do with it, then we can convince ourselves it's okay to skirt that rule a little bit. And we can do that with Command Beacon. Lazav is not well liked. Lazav is hated. It has hexproof, so it cannot be directly interacted with our opponent, so there is no spot removal. However, board wipes are very real, and in EDH, they're a dime a dozen. So we could, in most cases, expect Lazav to hit that command zone 2 or 3 times in a game. Getting up to an overall CMC of 8, maybe 10 with commander tax starts to become a little daunting when we need to get Lazav out onto the battlefield and additionally activate another ability or cast a spell in order to trigger his ability. Having Command Beacon on the battlefield under our control allows us to tap and sacrifice it and then put Lazav into our hand, casting it for its true mana value and not having to worry about all of the commander tax accumulated during an entire game. Command Beacon's ability to get Lazav into our hand to dance around commander tax is justification and rationalization strong enough to include a non-basic colorless mana source in this deck. And card 99, and so much of what I said about Command Beacon is going to apply to this land. It does not give us colored mana, but it will help us to win the game. And that is Rogue's Passage. Taps for a colorless, but we can pay 4 mana and target creature can't be blocked this turn. Lazav has hexproof, which means our opponents cannot interact with it, but we can. Caution should be noted. We do have a copy of Lightning Greaves in this deck. If Lightning Greaves is equipped to Lazav, Rogue's Passage cannot target Lazav because of the Shroud. So be careful with that potential interaction. It could be a sticking point and feel real bad if you've got that equipment on Lazav and no way to get it off. Absent an equipped Lightning Greaves to Lazav, Rogue's Passage will make Lazav unblockable if no other components of our Voltron package is able to do so. Lazav will swing in with unblockable commander damage, and hopefully it will be lethal. And there you have it, MTGBC. This is Lazav Dimir Mastermind. It is one of the commander decks found in the Burgeoning Commander Catalog. I appreciate any feedback or comments you may have about this deck. Please leave them in the comments section below. You may also search in the description below for a link to the full deck list over at tappedout.net. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.